In this section, I will show you how to cut all the fabrics. What I'll be using is rayon hem tape, thread, silk charmeuse for lining, zipper which I'll cut down, hair canvas for the interfacing in the waistband, and this lovely checked wool. The first thing that I will do is steam the fabric really well. Steaming will not only take the wrinkles out, it will take care of any minimal shrinkage that will happen, so that as I work with the garment, it doesn't continue to get smaller. Another way to pre-shrink your woolen is to take a damp towel, roll the cloth in the damp towel and let it sit overnight. Then let it air dry. Deciding which is the right side and the wrong side. I'm going to put a safety pin on what I consider to be the wrong side of the fabric. On better woolens, usually the inside of the fold. In other words, if the fabric is folded at the store, the inside is usually the better side. I've also marked it with chalk. Let's take a look at the charmeuse. The edges that are vertical are actually the cross grains, and I pulled a thread and cut on the fabric in the empty space where the thread was pulled away. Now I'd like to show you what happens when you just tear the fabric. I'm going to tear in a couple of different places. This would be the cross grain. And you see how it flutes. It kind of gets bumpy. Sometimes you can get it out with steam, but it can mar your fabric. So in most cases, I will pull the thread and cut on the empty space. Steaming once again to get all the wrinkles out, and also to help eliminate any future shrinkage with normal wear and care of the garment. This piece of wool is quite large. So that it's easier to work with, I will determine how much I need for the skirt and cut that amount off. This is another way to measure. Measure the width of the largest area of the pattern pieces. And the length. And measure the fabric accordingly. Now, this particular fabric, because it's woven, the check is woven, it's not printed, I can cut right on the checks. I always give myself a little extra. Again, giving myself a little extra. The backing for the box pleat and the waistband, I can cut later out of this larger piece that remains. Marking the wrong side again in a different place, making sure I mark both pieces very well. You can use normal chalk. I like the wheel, especially when I need to get into tiny places. And it also leaves a more accurate line, but I do use both. Trimming the selvage off to let the fabric relax. And I have the right side of the fabric up, facing us. Determining where I want the hip line to be. I'm going to use this soft thread. This is actually basting thread. Real basting thread is very soft, 100% cotton, and breaks easily. It's not good for sewing, but it's good for hand basting because when you need to pull it out, it comes out easily. On a fine silk or fine cotton, I would use a very, very lightweight silk thread. I'm basting along the hip line, following the checked pattern. Now to determine where I would like to place the center front grain line. aligning the center front and the hip lines with the basted lines on the fabric. The fabric on this side is still tight from the selvage, so I'm going to trim a little bit more, which will help it relax, thus allowing me to lay the pattern on top of the check and match everything perfectly. Determining where I want center back to be and basting down that line following the check pattern. Now you can understand why it's helpful to have both left and right back skirt pattern pieces. It's very important to take your time and carefully place the paper pattern upon this fabric so that when you're finished making the skirt, everything is perfectly aligned. Think about the grains. We have the cross grain, the horizontal grain at the hip, and that wants to follow a check all the way from center front, around to center back, and then from center back around back to the center front on the other side. Then think of the straight grains, the length grains. We not only have the center back seam allowance, which is parallel to the grain line in center back, but extending down further, the pleat area, and then on the side seam from the hip to the hem is a straight line perpendicular to the cross grain. So that can follow the check. There's so many ways to check this paper pattern on top of the fabric before you cut, and it's very important to take your time to do so. Another area of reference is the hemline, the very bottom edge of the pattern. Because it is a straight line and perpendicular to the length grain, it also follows the pattern of the fabric. The only areas that do not follow a straight line are at the waist because of the dart and curve of the waistline, and the hip lines, from the waist to the hip line. And finally, this last back piece, I want to place it on the fabric to be an exact mirror image of the back piece on the right. This is a wonderful exercise in learning to match. Match plaids, match checks, match sometimes flowers, depending on how they are printed on the fabric or woven. Really matching of anything, but mostly checks and plaids as we learn to make suits and coats This is a good starting point. And carefully cutting as close to the edge of the paper as possible. When possible, keep the fabric as still as you can while you cut, simply because if you have to move the fabric, it can make the fabric be pushed off grain. Once your pieces are cut, be sure to go back and mark the wrong sides of the fabric on each piece so that I have a reference and it's easy to find where I've marked it. I usually mark in the hemline. Now to make some tailor tacks and do some thread tracing to mark the darts and some of the notches. Taking the cotton basting thread, a double thread that's not knotted at the bottom, and a long thread, I'm going to mark the tip of the dart. I'm going straight down through all layers and coming up about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch above, just so you have a tiny, tiny amount of the fabric taken, and leave a long tail. Again, straight down through all layers at the tip, and above the tip, about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away, come back up and leave a long tail of thread. To mark the side seam and the waist, I'm coming in at the 3/4 inch side seam where it intersects with the waist and coming up at the top of the side seam, at the very top of the fabric. To mark the top of the dart, I'm going to put my needle in where the leg of the dart intersects the waistline and come out at the top of the pattern area and make a loop, again leaving a tail. Be sure to clip the top of the loop. Remove any remaining pins. And carefully peel the paper pattern away from the fabric, anchoring it with your fingers or a tool if necessary. Folding the fabric right sides together and aligning the thread tracings at the top of the dart, pinning it securely. double checking the tailor tack at the bottom to make sure it went exactly where I wanted it to go, and marking it with a pin. This way my dart is pinned together, ready to sew. You can see on the wrong side of the fabric, the tailor tack and the thread tracings are the smooth threads, not with the tails. And marking the back pieces the same way I did the front. Although I did not mark the side seam of this piece with a thread tracing, it is the same amount of seam allowance as the front, so it's okay. And now to cut the waistband, back of the box pleat, and the lining. First, I have to determine which is the right and wrong side of the fabric. I have the cross grain at the top, horizontally. Because this has a check, I want the middle of the waistband, the center front of the waistband, to fall in exactly the same place on the fabric as the center front of the body of the skirt. Marking my center front line. Cutting off the selvage. I don't want to cut the entire selvage off because there's still a lot of good fabric left, and I like to keep the selvage on until it needs to be taken away. Marking the side seam notches. And the center back notches. When I go to sew the waistband onto the skirt, I like it to be pre-pressed. In other words, press that fold line before you start to sew the garment. If you sew the garment or sew the waistband to the garment and then do your pressing, it's much more difficult to get a straight line. Sometimes it helps to anchor it with pins. this waistband inside the seam allowance is 29¼ inches, and folded it will be 1 inch. This gives me a guideline for cutting the interfacing. On to the lining fabric. As I mentioned, this piece of lining was sized by pulling a thread across the cross grain and cutting along that empty space, not tearing the fabric, although it does tear nicely. Charmeuse is extremely slippery. So what I'm going to do is pin all of the edges together and use my rulers, my straight edges, to create right angles in the fabric before laying the pattern pieces on top. This way I can make sure that the grain lines are very accurate. Sometimes people only address the length grain, but the cross grain is equally important. Because this is the lining, I'm not going to cut the selvages off. They're not going to be in the way. And this fabric frays very, very easily. So keeping the selvages on while I prepare it for cutting will actually be to my benefit. While I have folded it with the right sides together, it probably would be easier to handle this fabric if the wrong sides were put together because it has more friction. The friction would make it stick together a little more easily, thus making all the edges meet without the slippery quality of the shiny side. Now, by taking my L-shaped ruler and aligning the fold along that long edge and the vertical grain, which is the cross grain along the vertical edge of the ruler, this helps me to make right angles. You want these angles to be perfectly right angles before laying the pattern down on top of the fabric. That way you can be sure to get the grain perfectly aligned, matching the grain lines of the pattern to the true grain lines of the fabric. Checking carefully the cross grain. Charmeuse is a very slippery fabric. If you're new to linings, you might consider using a good rayon before you use a charmeuse. Once you're comfortable using a rayon, then advance to charmeuse. Double checking the cross grain from the opposite edge of the fabric. And now repeating the process with the back pattern piece. Sometimes the metal end of the tape measure catches on the pattern. Instead of using tailor tacks, I'm simply taking a straight pin and putting it straight through the tip of the dart. Then I can transfer that mark to the other side of the fabric. Clipping my notches only 1/8 or maybe 3/16 of an inch. Clipping the hip notch. The notches that would be clipped on this would be center front, side seam, hip, and darts. Notice that I'm not pulling the fabric closer to me. Again, because charmeuse is slippery, it would pull it off grain. Even though it's pinned well, it would shift a little bit. So my cutting will be easier and more accurate if I leave it as still as possible. hip notch, seam allowance notch. Checking notches, clipping the tops of the darts, center back, the hip grain line with 2 to indicate the bottom of the zipper. To understand the diagonal slash, I'm leaving the pattern on top of the fabric. Normally what I would do is stitch along the center back seam about 1 inch before that slash and a right angle at the base of the slash for about 1 inch. That reinforces the fabric. Of course, you would do each piece of fabric individually and then slash. And finally, to cut the backing for the box pleat. I need to determine the wrong and right side of the fabric again, but also I don't want to destroy this beautiful remaining piece of fabric by cutting into the largest part of it. The center line of this pattern piece, which is also the length grain line, needs to fall on the check in the same place that the center back line of the skirt falls. And also, the hem line needs to match. If the hem line matches, then the checks all the way up should match. Trimming the fabric so that I can align the pattern in the same orientation that the skirt is along the check. Once again, marking the wrong side of the fabric. Because this fabric has somewhat of a rough texture, the little wheel has a hard time going across the fabric, so regular tailor's chalk would be much easier to use on this fabric. Also marking the wrong side of the fabric with a safety pin. Now to cut a piece of hair canvas for the interfacing of the waistband. Like other woven fabrics, the cross grain has a little bit of give while the length grain is sturdier. This waistband interfacing will be cut on the cross grain. I'm pulling a thread away from the edge and trimming off the excess. This will be on perfect grain now. Remember that the width of the waistband when the skirt is finished is 1 inch. I will be cutting the interfacing without any seam allowance. This way there will be no extra bulk in the seams. Using some steam to get the wrinkles out. Marking a line 1 inch away from the straight edge. This will be the width of the waistband. Determining the length that I need. And it's not a bad idea to cut it a little extra long. You can always trim away what is unnecessary. So let's take a look at all the pieces we have to make the skirt. One side of the back, the waistband and interfacing, the other side of the back and the front, as well as the backing for the box pleat and the lining. Now to sew the skirt.